Okay, we're going to talk about Genesis 6, 1 through 4, like it says here, the ancient original context to it. If you want sort of the print version of this, Reversing Hermon is where I spend the most time talking about the ancient Near Eastern background to Genesis 6, 1 through 4. You get some of it in Unseen Realm, naturally. But Reversing Hermon was, I did this book to sort of drill down specifically on Genesis 6, 1 through 4, or as the book of Enoch would refer to it, the sin of the watchers in 1 Enoch 6 through 16. And the thesis of the book is I want you to know not only what's going on here, and the ancient Near Eastern Mesopotamian background to it, but then how, if you know the background to it, how that material bleeds into the New Testament. So that's what Reversing Hermon is essentially about, the importance of this passage in a number of passages in the New Testament. So we're going to talk about these 4 verses and the 5th verse. That's going to be important, and there's a reason I put it this way. This is probably a familiar passage to most of you. When man, Adam, humankind, began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. It's an odd, strange passage, and probably familiar to most of you here. It's very controversial. Again, this is one of those that, let me put it this way. If you get into sort of an argument with somebody about this, that the sons of God are just people, sons of Seth, or kings, or whatever it is, what you have to realize is that the person in front of you is actually suggesting that the ancient Israelites looked at the passage like we do in a modern, anti-supernaturalistic, post-Enlightenment era. Just think about that. That is not their world. They are just out of the gate predisposed to supernaturalism. We are not, because of the time in which we live. There's a lot of water under the bridge between the Old Testament era and today. And we have had, again, our comfort level with the supernatural has been eroded steadily and consistently, because we think somehow that, we're moderns and we can dispense with this stuff. But since we're Christians, we sure need this, the virgin birth. We need the hypostatic union, the fact that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. Somehow, this isn't offensive to a rationalist post-Enlightenment worldview. Somehow we retain some respect if we believe this stuff, but we're going to lose all that if we look at Genesis 6 the same way, and other passages. And my answer is, why? I mean, that's the uncomfortable question. Why do you think this is sort of normal and acceptable and the other is not? Frankly, these are more astonishing. Okay, the idea of a Trinity. Like I said a few minutes ago, there's nothing that we believe in the core doctrines of Christianity that is going to be acceptable on a purely rationalistic, materialistic basis. Zero. So you might as well face up to it. Now, I will say it's all defensible in terms of its philosophical, intellectual coherence. All these ideas, beginning with theism, the Genesis 6 stuff is, again, I tend to think of things very simply. all of this stuff extends from the major premise that there is a God. It's theism. If that premise holds, then ideas that extend from it are like these. Well, can God do stuff? Can he create? Well, sure. Does he create with a purpose? Is it possible that he could, endow his supernatural creatures with the ability to take on, human form? Well, again, we know that from passages in the Bible. Is that form physical? I mean, you go down the list of all the things that can God do this, and it's a really short list of the things God can't do. I mean, I try not to put the words can't and God into too many sentences. But again, all of these ideas that, unfortunately, even within the evangelical community, we take the supernatural stuff in the Bible and we say, this is valid and this is invalid. I don't know what gives us the authority to make these two categories, but we do it thinking again that we need to do it to defend ourselves as not crazy people. Okay, nothing we believe that is integral, the concept of sin and the removal of sin, that is inherently, inescapably supernatural. Why is that one acceptable and this isn't? And since the idea of God has been defended philosophically, its coherence has been defended and has held for millennia, it's done really well. Since it holds these other things that derive from it, there's no reason to just dismiss them out of the gate. But again, unfortunately, in our context, that makes a number of people uncomfortable. It made Augustine uncomfortable. And that's really why we sort of have grown up as a church, as big C Christianity, with the Sethite view. Everybody in the Jewish community and the early Christian community, there's one possible exception in a passage in Philo, but all of the texts we have up until just before the time of Augustine with a guy named Julius Scipio Africanus believed that what's described in Genesis 6:1-4 was a divine transgression, a supernatural rebellion that impacted humanity. That this is what's being described here. That changes, again, in the 4th century. And because of Augustine's stature, and frankly, he had a problem with the Book of Enoch because of his history with the Manichees. When he became a Christian, he was part of the Manichean sect for a while. And things did not go well. And the Manichees revered the Book of Enoch for different reasons. And so by the time Augustine emerges from that, he has a bone to pick with them and with the Book of Enoch and all this stuff, and he just goes the other direction. And because of the magnitude of his personality, who he was as a theologian, basically the rest of the church followed suit. And Augustine has that kind of weight in other areas too. But this, again, is part of that. And so we call, as I say in Unseen Realm, we call out hermeneutical SWAT teams to make passages like this not say what they say, while we keep stuff like the Trinity and the virgin birth. It's very inconsistent. I understand why we do that, but it's very inconsistent. Now, Peter and Jude, I think, is typically the place to start. We're not going to go through all the ins and outs of the Sethite view, but Peter and Jude clearly did not view the sons of God in this incident as mere humans. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell, this is going to be, we're going to come back to this. The word there is sent them to Tartarus. Tartarao is the verb. And committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept with until judgment. If he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, a herald of righteousness, with 7 others, when he brought a flood upon the world of God. I mean, it's clear, the context is clearly the flood. He refers to them as angels that sinned. Why isn't that clear? Well, it's not clear because people don't want it to be clear, and then again, you call out the hermeneutical SWAT team to make it say something other than what it actually says. There are real problems with that. There's no other candidate for angels that sinned. Now, some people will reflexively go, well, what about the third of the angels rebelling, before humans were created and the fall of Lucifer and stuff like that? Okay, try not to be shocked here, but there isn't a single verse in the Bible that describes a rebellion of a third of the angels before the creation of humanity. 0. The only place, in fact, that you get the word third with the word angel is Revelation 12, which is the last book of the Bible. And the reference is to again, pardon the pun, the fallout of the birth of the Messiah. That's what you've got. Now, we basically get this third of the angels rebelling before creation from 2 sources. One is it was imported there in the 19th century to help argue something called the gap theory. The other is writers like Milton, Paradise Lost. Okay, neither of those things is the biblical text. But they were just, again, these are things that get passed on from generation to generation to generation. And they in this case, they actually become in some way doctrine. That does happen with a few subjects. But if you actually go with the biblical text, and of course, one that's associated with the flood, you don't really have any ammunition there. So it's kind of obvious that the casting into hell, chains of gloomy darkness, you'll notice these descriptions, you're not going to find the casting anyway, and you're not going to find a specific reference to chains in the Old Testament, either in Genesis 6 or elsewhere. So Peter is drawing on something else. Now we're going to find out that the something else happens to be the book of Enoch, and the book of Enoch, though, draws on a Mesopotamian story that really was the background to Genesis 6. You realize that Enoch and other Dead Sea Scrolls, like guys like Gilgamesh actually appear by name in those texts. Whoever's writing that material has a very strong acquaintance with Mesopotamian material. And it's going to come out in what's called the story of the Apkallu, which is the Mesopotamian backstory to why we even have Genesis 6, 1 through 4 in the Bible. Peter and Jude aren't going back and reading cuneiform. They don't need to, because that material has been preserved in books like Enoch. And so this is where they're getting it. Jude 6 and 7, the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in, there's the chains again, there's the gloomy darkness again, until the judgment of the great day. Then he mentions Sodom and Gomorrah. What happens before Sodom and Gomorrah in the biblical story? Well, it's the story of the flood, so here we go again, the angels that sin. And again, any commentator, any academic commentator will tell you that there's a strong relationship between 2 Peter and Jude, in terms of its content and all that kind of stuff, and its vocabulary. Again, it's set in a sexual context, and likewise indulged in sexual immorality. And again, there's really no other possible reference than Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And Peter and Jude aren't afraid of that. It doesn't bother them. It bothers a lot of people now, but it doesn't bother them. Kept in chains under gloomy darkness. Again, that really points to the original context, as we will see. So the real death blow to the Sethite view is this question: are you going to interpret Scripture against its original context or not? And I have said on my blog that I've referenced, I'll just spell it out for you. If you want to go look for this will be the easy way to find it. Go to Google, put in my website, drmsh.com, and then put in the author's last name, Anus, A-N-U-S, N-N-U-S. Amar Anos is his full name. He's a cuneiform scholar in Helsinki. And then Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And you will find his article. He wrote an article in 2010 that is just really of fundamental importance. The article is called On the Origin of the Watchers. And he traces, because this is his field, he's a Mesopotamian guy, he traces Enoch's Watcher story back on many levels and in many layers back into the Mesopotamian stuff. And in so doing, he provides, again, from the Old Testament world, the context of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. He shows you what Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is shooting at. And he also does something that is really important. Have you ever read Genesis 6, 5? Okay, that's the verse about, that God, saw the wickedness of man, that every imagination of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. Well, what does that have to do with the first 4 verses? Have you ever wondered that? Like, why did we get to that verse? How do we get from Genesis 6, 1 through 4 to that? If you know the backstory, you have the answer to that, and I'm going to show you that today. It's completely consistent and coherent. It's just that the writer of Genesis 6 assumes that you know the context because he's writing to people in his world, not ours. Yes, ma'am. drmsh.com, that's my homepage. And the last name of the guy is A-N-N-U-S. And you could put in Genesis 6, 1 through 4. It's going to be the top, first or second hit in the Google results. But you can download his article there. Now, let's go back to Peter. This cast them into hell, tartarao is the Greek verb, cast them into Tartarus. This is another important clue. Tartarus was the place in the Greek Titan story where the Titans, who are rebellious gods, they're not people, folks, they're rebellious gods, they were cast for their transgression. Again, it's a clear, if you're using this verb in this place, it's a clear, unmistakable reference to a divine rebellion. That's all it can be. So again, do you want to interpret the passage in light of its own context or what context that you give it so that it's more comfortable? That's the question. So 2 Peter and Jude refer to the rebellious sons of God being imprisoned in darkness. Now, where does all this stuff come from? Again, the short answer is Peter and Jude are dipping into Enoch and other Second Temple texts. Jubilees has this stuff in it, the Book of the Giants from Qumran. The Book of the Giants is a fragmentary text. I don't know anywhere, like on the internet, where the English translation is published. There is a complete, very thorough, even mind-numbingly thorough, scholarly edition of the Book of Giants from Qumran by Lawrence Stuckenbrook, which is really good. And we have it in Logos, by the way, so you could actually just read the translation there. But I'm just not sure where you could find that. And again, most of it's fragmentary anyway. There's just sections of it. But this is the material, again, that the New Testament writers had access to, and they're reading this stuff because it's part of what their community is producing, talking about the Bible. It's like if I read a commentary on a biblical book, or you read, some book about a biblical topic. This is what they're doing. They're not doing anything different than what we do. They read books. And some of those books help them process information and become very useful when they try to articulate a thought in their own writings. It's just the most normal thing in the world. This is how people do research and how they think about things and then how they write things. Right? So in 1 Enoch, the sons of God are known as watchers. That's the major term. And it's a biblical term as well. It occurs 4 times in the Old Testament, all of them in Daniel 4. And it's a neutral term in Daniel 4. I guess I could say a positive one. Just don't conclude, at least in Daniel 4, that watchers are bad guys. They're not. In Second Temple literature, they are, because everybody's talking about Genesis 6. So they're bad guys there. They descend to, on or to Mount Hermon, and they make a vow to corrupt humanity. Again, their sin isn't just the transgression with daughters of men. There's something worse in the Jewish mind. And Enoch says, and this will be, again, important for the connection to the Messiah, that the sons of God taught humans certain points of knowledge that led to self-destruction and idolatry. So, in other words, what this is really saying is, look, human depravity, which began in Genesis 3 at the fall, there's rebellion, it was accelerated and taught to perform better by divine intelligences who wanted to destroy humans. That's the thought, that there are oppositional supernatural intelligences, both then and of course now, that love to have people, love to help people, love to play on our propensities and our depravities and our proclivities, our sinful impulses, our desire for autonomy from authority. They love to help that along so that we can more effectively destroy ourselves and the people around us. And the bonus is we can become idolaters. We worship other gods. We're no God at all. We worship ourselves. This was the big concern in Second Temple literature. It wasn't the Nephilim, because according to the biblical text, the Nephilim lines are wiped out during the time of David, who, by the way, is the archetype for the Messiah. That might be important. Okay? That's when that ends, but this problem persists. It's a big issue. Here are some of the things, again, that they taught. There's astrology, technology for warfare, helps to kill more people effectively. Roots and spells, the drugs, the cosmetics, which sounds odd, but the point is, again, seduction, immorality outside the boundaries of marriage, and all that kind of stuff, just sexual indulgence. So this is the backdrop, actually, for Genesis 6:5. See, the reason we have verse 5 is because if you know the rest of the story in Genesis 6:1-4, it's not just the Nephilim. If you know that the story is also responding to something about supernatural intelligences corrupting humans from within, if you know that, Genesis 6:5 makes perfect sense. Because the effect of all this is that every thought of the imagination of their hearts was only evil continually. Now, Peter and Jude know this because they do know the backstory. And the backstory extends again from Second Temple literature, which draws on earlier Mesopotamian stuff. And that's what we want to get into. So here's the verse 5. And have you ever wondered, again, how this follows? Enoch preserves why. Again, we have a fall, but we have the problem of depravity that is related to this incident. Now, it seems contrived, but where does Enoch get this stuff? And here we go with Mesopotamia. There's a Mesopotamian backstory to Genesis 6:1-4, the depravity of Genesis 6:5. And this is where Anas's article that I just gave you the reference to, this is where he lives. He is the guy who, again, it was a simple thing. He's like, it's been a while since a cuneiform person, scholar, looked at all that flood stuff specifically with an eye toward the first 4 verses of Genesis 6. Not the flood. I mean, everybody does that. Okay, connections between Mesopotamian flood stories and the biblical flood story. I mean, they've been doing that since the late 1800s, okay? But what about the first 4 verses? I'm going to go back and look at the cuneiform material and just see, what's there. And his article tells you what's there. Every element is there. Again, there's Anas's article. The story is the story of a group called the Apkallu. And it establishes the concept. And by the way, since it was Anas who deserves credit for ferreting this stuff out, and his material was published in 2010, I've said this on my blog and I'll say it here. All Genesis commentaries written before 2010 and even after that do not interact with Anas's study are by definition obsolete. on this passage. You either interact with the material or you don't. And, it's only been 2010 that somebody did the grunt work to do this. So, we can give a pass to older commentators, but you can't give a pass now because the job of scholars is supposed to be to keep up with this stuff. So if you're not doing it, you're either negligent or you don't want your readers to see it. You got one of two choices and neither of them are very good. It's either incompetence or malice. I take your pick. Okay. Now, the Apkallu, again, are divine beings, and so there's really no doubt that the sons of God are going to be divine beings. So here we go. This is the entry from DDD, which was actually published before 2010, but it's nowhere near as detailed as Anna's. This entry describes the Apkallu as the culture heroes from before the flood in Mesopotamian thinking. Now that term culture heroes means this. The Mesopotamians believed that the Apkallu were these supernatural beings that deserved credit for helping the Mesopotamians to develop their civilization. They gave them knowledge to become great. Okay, that's what a culture hero is in academia. See, I'm the academese translator here. They're the culture heroes from before the flood in the service of Ea, a variety of wisdom traditions from the antediluvian, that means before the flood. A variety of wisdom traditions from the antediluvian period were supposedly passed on by the Apkallu. Again, this is Mesopotamian theology, if you will. They're referred to as 7 sages. They were created in the river. The Akkadian term is actually the Abzu, the abyss. That might become important later on. Okay? That's where they're created. And they served as those who ensured the correct functioning of the plans of heaven and earth. In other words, they were pretty smart. They knew lots of stuff. Following the example of Ea, who is the god of wisdom in the Mesopotamian pantheon, they taught mankind wisdom, social forms, craftsmanship, basically what you need to have a civilization. So in Mesopotamian thinking, these are good guys. These are wonderful guys. I mean, they helped us become as great as we are. The gods gave us our civilization, in effect. The Apkallu then were the wise divine beings from the watery abyss, the underworld, the place opposite the heavens. In Mesopotamian religion, they were responsible for maintaining the correct balance between heaven and earth. That was the will of the greater gods, which of course sets the stage for, well, what if they do something that puts it out of balance? The Apkallu possessed knowledge from the divine world that made heaven and earth tick. Before the flood, they gave knowledge to humans to civilize them. Now, this was important to the scribes of Babylon living after the flood because the scribes were the ones who inherited this stuff. And so the question naturally arose, well, where did you get it? Where did you get it? And the scribes said, well, we got it from the Apkallu. And people would say, well, no, wait a minute. There was a flood, and like, how did that work? So they're asking the same question in Mesopotamia. It's really interesting as a little bit of sidebar. If you actually go to the Mesopotamian text, and Anna does a nice job of this, and you look at the specifics of what Enoch says the Watchers taught, and then you look at the areas of expertise of the Apkallu, guess what? They align. What a coincidence. Babylonians, of course, looked at this quite differently than Jews did. The scribes took great pains to establish the notion that their knowledge was directly inherited from the gods. See, that's why you should listen to us, because we get our knowledge from the gods. That's where our authority comes from. The problem, of course, is the flood. So, how does this work? How did the knowledge of the pre-flood Apkallu survive the flood? There are Mesopotamian texts. Again, one of the more important here is the poem of Era, the Era epic. But there are Mesopotamian tablets, and Annas, again, has all this. that list 7 pre-flood kings, and just a list of kings, each of them accompanied by an assisting Apkallu, the divine sage who gave the king the knowledge necessary for civilization, of course, to rule. After the flood, there are 4 post-flood Apkallu mentioned, and they are described as being of human descent. Now, before the flood, they're not described that way. Before the flood, they're completely divine. They're supernatural beings. After the flood, they're also of human descent. The 4th post-flood Apkallu is further described as being only 2/3 Apkallu. He's a hybrid, again, to use a kind of a clunky word. But that's what the tablets have. These 2 elements, divine beings now of human descent and only 2/3 Apkallu, are important for the specific reason we'll get into in a moment. For now, the implication of these sources is that the post-flood Apkallu were the result of interbreeding with human women, the same sort of description in Genesis 6:1-4. Now, Annas was not the first scholar to note this particular point. Ann Kilmer has an important article. It's in a festschrift to Francis Anderson down here. Here's the citation. I'm not able to post this one on my site, again, for copyright reasons. Humans and Apkallu could presumably mate, since we have a description of the 4 post-flood Apkallu as of human descent, the 4th being only 2/3 Apkallu as opposed to pre-flood pure Apkallu and subsequent human sages. After the flood, the totally human sages are called by this term, the Umanu. So we've got divine Apkallu before the flood. After the flood, we've got kind of 2/3 and 1/3, or hybrid Apkallu. They're also of human descent, and they're different than the humans that would come later, who don't have this situation going on. Back to the fourth one, the 2/3 Apkallu. It's really interesting that this description, being 2/3 divine, is the same description given to Gilgamesh, who is called Lord of the Apkallu in one existing cuneiform text. Gilgamesh was also a giant. Like, seriously? I mean, you see what's happening here. All of the elements are emerging from this story. Gilgamesh was a giant in Mesopotamian text. He's also mentioned by name in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Book of the Giants. What a coincidence. Lo, how do you like that? The apparent mating with humans displeased Marduk in the Mesopotamian story. Marduk doesn't like this, because if you remember the Mesopotamian flood story, some of the higher up gods are like disturbed from their sleep by humans. Oh, they're noisy. They're just kind of a pain. Let's destroy them all. And so the gods get together and say, yeah, I'd like a few more hours every night. So let's get rid of them. And so that's what they decide. Now the Apkallu hear about this, and it's like, good grief, man, we put a lot of work into these people. It's terrible. We got to do something to make sure that our work survives. And so they do what they do, and you get the hybrid Apkallu situation go on. And Marduk hears about it, and he's like, oh, that ticks me off. Don't you realize where you're at in the pecking order here? You do what I say, not the other way around. You don't circumvent what we're trying to do here. So what Marduk does is he judges the Apkallu by sending them back to the abyss, never to return. Does that sound a little bit like getting sent into the abyss, into Tartarus, and chained in gloomy darkness until the time of the end? Here's a summary. Pre-flood Apkallu were wholly divine. Post-flood Apkallu are of human descent. They dispense divine knowledge to humans, which is, to the Jews, this was horrible because it produces depravity and idolatry. To the Mesopotamians, this is like, man, you guys are awesome. Because even though the higher-up gods wanted to wipe us out, some of us survive, and your knowledge that helped us build civilization survives too. You guys get 2 thumbs up. So the Mesopotamians viewed the Apkallu positively. The higher gods, again, they sentence, Marduk sentenced the Apkallu to the abyss. They are kicked out of the divine council. They're rebels. They're in a state of rebellion now. Every element of Genesis 6:1-4 is accounted for. Gilgamesh is the key connection, who is specifically referenced in the Book of the Giants at Qumran and a few other places. So what's the point? Mesopotamian religion, Apkallu, were wonderful. They're the reason for Babylon's greatness. The reason Babylon is the top of the heap. In Israel, that's not really good news. There are two things that are the problem. One is you've got the giant clans, okay, and the physical result of this, again, however this works, I'm not a deity, so I don't know, is that we have rival people groups running around now, and ultimately in the biblical story, they're going to be the ones that confront the Israelites in their quest for their homeland. And as I detail in Unseen Realm, it's my view that the details of the conquest tell us that the harem, the devoting to destruction concept, the devoting to destruction thrust of the conquest is specifically aimed at eliminating the Anakim, who are the descendants of the Nephilim according to Numbers 13:32 and 33. There are a number of reasons why I say that. The conquest narrative begins with the Anakim, who are, again, the descendants of the Nephilim, according to the biblical text anyway. They're the ones that are spotted by the spies. The spies come back and say, man, we love this place, but guess what? Let's just turn around and run because we're like dog meat. We're just gonna get our butts kicked here because they're huge. They're a whole lot bigger than we are. And that leads to God's punishment of the 70 years wandering. They come back, and God sends them up the Transjordan. Well, why does God do that? Well, he tells you in Deuteronomy 2 and 3. He tells Moses and Joshua, now look, you got to go up the other side, and you leave the Ammonites alone, you leave the Moabites alone, because the descendants of Esau, who is also related to Abraham, the descendants of Esau have already eliminated the giant clans in their regions. They're known as the Amim, the Zamzumim, the Zuz. Just leave them alone. That job's taken care of already. But you got to go up to Bashan because there's still a few of them there. Og of Bashan, okay, Sihon and Og, kings of the Amorites, which is an important term in the narrative. Og is a giant. He is described as the last of the Rephaim. But if you go to Amos 2, 9, and 10, when he describes the conquest, he uses the word Amorite and says, they were tall as cedars. It's not a coincidence. The Anakim, Rephaim, descendants of the Neph, all this stuff. So Moses and Joshua have to go up there and take care of business in the Transjordan. Then God says, now you come down. You cross into the land in the middle, the divide and conquer strategy. And at that point, when you get the battles, the karem verb and the verbs of killing, the verbs of annihilation, occur in battles in places where the Anakim are said to live in the conquest narrative. I don't think that's a coincidence. Because at the end of the conquest, in Joshua 11, how does Joshua define victory? There are no more Anakim in the land, except for the ones that escaped and got away, and they went to the Philistine cities, Gath and Ashdod. And where do we encounter the rest of them? Later. Goliath and his brothers. This is where they're from. The goal, now there's a lot of people killed, because it's not like you can blow a whistle and say, okay, like separate your Anakim here, The rest of you, there are other verbs of conquest in Joshua. Dispossess, drive them out, that are not verbs of killing. But the killing nomenclature occurs in passages, in places, cities and regions, especially the hill country, where the Anakim are said to live among the population. Now, the general population is fighting for their homeland. We get that. But the cherem, to devote to destruction, God is claiming the life of this thing, are the Anakim. You'll never see that if you're not if you're debunking Genesis 6, 1 through 4. You'll never see that. Because you want to say the Anakim are something other than what the text has. They're always described as unusual. And I don't think we're talking 10, 12, 30 feet high. I mean, Goliath himself, according to the Dead Sea Scrolls, was 6 foot 6 inches tall. Maybe 6'9", depending on what cubit you're using. Masoretic text has him taller, but the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls have him at 6'6". That is significant if the average human male, going by skeletons that have been excavated, in the Second Temple period, or not the Second Temple, the Old Testament period, second millennium, is about 5.5 feet tall. If you're 5.5 feet tall, go visit a basketball game, go to the NBA, and then I mean, if you're running into pockets of these people, and they're trained warriors, you're just a bunch of escapees from Egypt, okay? And they've got walled cities. It's like, what are you going to think? Well, if you're Joshua and Caleb, you think, Red Sea, no problem, okay? If you're everybody else, you think, where else can we live? Okay, this is just not going to go well. And of course, they pay the price for that. So we've got that plan, but the worst of it is the corruption of humanity. That is a problem. I mean, the Anakim stuff, the Nephilim, that's taken care of during the days of David. But this is not. This persists, and this becomes a huge focus of Second Temple writing. The fact that humanity is so bad, in part, because supernatural intelligences taught us to destroy ourselves and led us away from the true God. That has to be fixed. The Messiah is supposed to fix 3 things, not just one. See, we're taught, again, that the reason why the world is the way it is the fall, because that's the only one that we accept as rational. Again, that's just as non-rational as anything, and I know all the core documents of Christianity. If you asked an Israelite, 2nd century or Second Temple period Jew, why is the world such a mess? 3 reasons: the fall. And what's the problem? What's the problem the Messiah needs to cure at the fall? The death problem. You're no longer going to have everlasting life. You're under the curse of death. So the Messiah needs to fix the death problem. Genesis 6, 1 through 4, well, all that funky Anakim, Nephilim stuff, David took care of that. And again, isn't it nice that David is the prototype, the dynastic prototype and producer of the Messiah? David took care of that, but the Messiah who comes needs to address human depravity. By the way, how does he do that? The Holy Spirit. Jesus says several times, I have to go so that the Holy Spirit can come and reside within you. That is the blunting of depravity, the presence of the Spirit in the life of the believer. And Paul says on 2 occasions, the Lord, who is the Spirit. I mean, the Spirit is, again, it's just like Jesus and God. Jesus is but isn't God. He is God, but he's not the Father. The Spirit is but isn't Jesus. Well, he's separate and distinct. He's a person within the Trinity, but he's also in some way Jesus and God. It all works together. And Paul on 2 occasions refers to the Lord who is the Spirit. Lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Where 2 or 3 are gathered, I am in their midst. Gathered in my name, they're believers. It's the Spirit. So the Messiah is supposed to fix that. And the third thing the Messiah is supposed to fix is the third rebellion, which is Babel, the disinheritance, the divorcing of the nations. The nations need to be brought back into the family of God through the seed of Abraham, who is Jesus. It's a coherent, comprehensive plan. It's 3-faceted, not just one. But you'll never see the other 2 because we demythologize our Bible. That's why. So, the Jews are thinking all that. And it's like, man, the Messiah needs to fix, he's got a huge mess ahead of him, you know. So we understand, again, the context for Genesis 6:5, and what we need to do is we need to read Genesis 6:1 through 4 as a polemic response to the Mesopotamian theology of the day. No, the Apkallu are not good guys, and their transgression of heaven and earth was not a good thing. It led potentially to our annihilation as a people because of all, the Nephilim stuff, and it corrupted us. It made humanity wicked. It drove humanity away from the true God. It's not good. So you Mesopotamians out there, think what you will, okay? But the biblical writers are writing their own, again, primeval history, all the way up, to Abraham, and then everything else runs from there. And they want you to know that this episode, and I mean, who's Israel? I mean, they're going to be, these other nations are going to wipe their feet on Israel. So God wants people to know through the biblical writers that, look, you're going to hear that the reason that you're beaten, the reason that you are just inferior to these people is because of their gods, and specifically in Babylon, which is where the Old Testament story ends. You're going to hear that the reason for Babylon's superiority is that they are empowered by their gods. This is the reason why they're great. This is the reason why Babylon is incomparable. This is the reason why we conquered you. You're going to hear all that stuff, but we want you to know what the real story is and who's really in control. And this is why these 4 kind of, funky verses are there. It's part of a theology to help the family of Yahweh cope with their circumstances and their history. It's part of a theological response. Again, that's the end of what we'll do here. But again, we have lost this, essentially. Part of the whole Watcher thing, it leaks into the New Testament. I'm not going to go through reversing Hermann here because, there's I don't know if we have a lunch prepared or what's going on, or Q&A. But there are all sorts of ways that this idea that the Messiah has to fix this, 3 problems, but in reversing Hermann, I zero in this middle one, this whole Genesis 6 problem. There are a number of things that if you know the story, you'll read in the New Testament and you'll, okay, I know what he's tracking on here. I'll give you one example. It's probably 4 years ago now. I was at SBL, which is the Society of Biblical Literature. And it's not an evangelical group. It's just anybody who does biblical studies in the world. So I'm going through the program, and some of you who listen to the podcast have heard of David Burnett. Burnett's with me sitting, and we're going through the program. And I saw a paper by a guy named Tyler Stewart, who was at the time a doctoral student at Marquette, which is where Burnett is now. And the title was something like Bastard Spirits, the Watchers, and the Birth of the Son of God. And now, bastard spirits is what the Dead Sea Scrolls refer to. That's another term they use for the Watchers because they're hybrid. And we looked at each other and it's like, we are going to be in that room. Okay? We are not going to miss this paper. Because I don't know what this guy's going to do. But we read the abstract. He's going to go through Galatians 3 and 4. It's like, I'm not missing that one. And it was awesome. What he does, and again, I incorporate this in reversing Hermann. He went to Galatians 3 to start. And there's that familiar line that the law was added because of transgressions. Plural. See, we're trained to think that the law was added because of what Adam and Eve did and all. It's plural. And he said, now, we're just going to do a little thought experiment today. And it was more than that, but that he was prepping us. He said, what if the law was added because of transgressions? Just whose transgressions are we talking about? What if it's the transgressions of the watchers? I wonder if any Second Temple authors thought that. And then he just dumped on us. And it's like, holy cow, like I didn't realize that there it is. And it was just unbelievable. And then he tied it to the timing of the birth of the Son of God. And it was like, oh boy, I gotta get this paper. You know, what do I have to do to wrestle this from your hands, you know? And he was nice enough to give me the paper. But there are just things like that Second Temple period writers, they thought about that line, that idea, quite differently than we do. And when you get into that literature, you see that ain't the only place. There are things just dropped here and there in the New Testament that, you know, link back into not only Second Temple literature generally, but link back into this story in all sorts of really interesting ways. And this is why yesterday, when we talked about Enoch, look, it doesn't matter what status you assign or don't assign to the book of Enoch. What matters is that you become familiar with material that the biblical writers read. Because they're going to be responding to things. They're going to be dropping stuff. They assume that their audience will, again, pick up what they're laying down. They assume a familiarity that we just don't have. So it takes us work to recapture that. But you can do it. Again, I'm going to close with this, and a little part of my own testimony. And I told you yesterday, when I became a believer, I basically didn't know anything. My parents got divorced when I was 5. My brother was 3. My mom had to go out and work like single moms do. And even when she got remarried, my dad was an alcoholic, and so he couldn't keep a job. So my mom has to work all the time. And so we got shipped to my grandma's a lot. Now my grandma lived next door to a family, single mom again, with 4 kids. 2 of them had cystic fibrosis. I don't know how she made it, because they just struggled mightily. We had it good, like compared to what's going on over there. So but they were Christians. The lady was a Christian, and her oldest son became my best friend growing up. If you've read my novels, Brian Scott, it's this kid's name. Okay, so I go over to his house, and they have devotions. And so I'm there. I'm either sleeping over or whatever. I'm allowed to stay. And I'm marveling, like, this kid knows, like, who's this Abraham dude? And, I just thought that, like, he was just this fount of information. And he's 9. Okay? It's just like, I don't know what's going on here. But it was through them, that I get my first exposure to the gospel. And, later on, I only really became a Christian. I really only grasped the gospel when I was 16, when we were in high school. But I really didn't know much more because I never read the Bible. I'm not over at this kid's house every day. So there I am. And so I start reading the Bible. So what I tell people, because I get it, it's like you can listen to this stuff, you can watch the YouTube video, all that stuff, listen to the podcast, and you think, there is no way I'm ever going to know the things I want to know. It's just overwhelming. It's not overwhelming. It's overwhelming if you look at it cumulatively. Okay, I am the result of 5 minutes a day for a long time. If you learn one new thing about Scripture or about some point of context, if you learn one new thing every day, in 365 days, you got a good pile. And that's 1 year. You have to break up the task into digestible bits. That's all I did. Now, I'll confess I was a geek, right? You know, I couldn't, like, not do it. So I'll confess that part. But if you have enough ambition to just learn something new every day, you are going, in a couple of years' time, you know, you're going to be a rock star in your church, okay? You're going to be the one that gets the questions because you're learning. You're learning. And this is why I believe, sincerely, that most pastors dramatically underestimate both the appetite and the aptitude for content. I do not have a photographic memory. I had a good memory in high school. It's the only thing I was kind of good at was school. I mean, I played sports and all that kind of stuff, but I wasn't getting any scholarships, trust me. You know, and I had no direct, I could regale you with ridiculous stories of how dumb I was in high school because I had no direction. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll tell you just one, just to show you how bad it was. We go in to take our SATs. Everybody who's like been to high school, you got to take the SATs. So I'm like everybody else, I'm herded into this room, you put the paper down in front of you, you got a pencil, yeah, you know, like, take this test. Well, at the end of the test, it says you have to put a number in to get your scores sent to a college, or they won't take the test. It's like, what do you mean you won't take the test? I'm done with it. Well, you got to put a number in. And I'm like, really? Like, I don't know. So they give you the list, you know, all these numbers of institutions, and I'm looking through the list. And I put the number in for the University of Kentucky. Why? Because I went to high school with Sam Bowie, who was drafted ahead of Michael Jordan. That's his claim of infamy. And Sam was going to the University of Kentucky. And so I thought, well, if I go there, I'll know somebody. That's what I did. I had no direction at all. Here's the test. You happy now? You know, I don't know what I'm doing. So again, I did not go to Kentucky. You know, I tell you stuff like that because you got to get away from this notion that this is an insurmountable mountain. It's not. Again, the dirty little secret is that you can actually do a lot of this stuff. Now, I'm fortunate that I work at Logos, and we manufacture all these tools and stuff like that. You know, and that's why it's there. You live at a unique time. Never before, I didn't have any of this stuff going through college and graduate school. I didn't have software. If it existed, I couldn't afford it because I'm putting myself through school. I mean, but you have the internet. You have software. You have access to an amazing amount of material. Your task in that level in terms of access is both easier and more complex because there's just so much now. You know, but it's still something that's reducible to a little bit of your time every day. So don't look at this like it's just this, I'm giving up. You know, I'll read your book, but I'm out of here. You know, no, don't check out. Don't check out. Because you actually can do this. Terry, I think you're in the back, so I'm done rambling now. So.